Many things in the world of model aviation have been more of a mystery over the years than buffing out paint. It's really not a difficult task. It's really not a difficult skill to learn. But if you have a little bit of help, pretty much anybody should be able to buff out a nice coat of dope or lacquer. Hi, I'm Wendy Ortnowski, and I'd like to help you try to get a basic understanding of some of the very basic skills that are required to buff out a coat of paint. Now, I'd like to share a little bit of information with you. Obviously, a lot of this technology comes from outside the world of model airplanes. In my case, it came from having a custom motorcycle business years ago, and one of the things that we specialized in was doing these kind of custom paint jobs. This is me on the cover of Motorcycle World, and this is one of the original bikes that I had painted. This is my bike, in fact. Now, if you look real close at this old magazine, you'll notice that's me riding a bike. And I wasn't that good. But one of the things I was real good at, I was real patient and real diligent about learning the art of painting. And painting motorcycles, except for the fact that on airplanes you want to keep it as light as possible, most of the skills that go into buffing and finishing an airplane aren't a whole lot different than motorcycles. Now, we're really going to start this video off with what I think is some of the most basic things in the world of model aviation. That is sanding a piece of wood flat. If you don't have a concept of what sanding things flat is, you're really going to have a difficult time understanding why and how, or what will make buffing a little bit easier or more difficult. You need to have the concept in your mind of a flat piece of wood. The second concept is not only to have the wood flat, but to have the filler coats and the tissue and the silver coats as flat as possible. If they aren't flat, the best buffing job in the world isn't going to do you a whole lot of good. All it's going to do is accent the mistakes. Now, a very not so original but legitimate way to think about a buffing job. A good buffing job starts the same as a motorcycle. It starts in the sheet metal or it starts in the wood itself. It starts by having flat, light reflective surfaces to work with. Now, once you have good, flat, reasonably nicely contoured surfaces, and you bring the filler coats up into silver, the silver at that point in time is only there to identify and help you pick out all the little mistakes that you're going to find along the way. And if you've never done a silver base coat job, when you put it in silver the first time, be prepared to go out for a beer or a pizza because you're probably going to be real unhappy. The silver shows all the mistakes. But the point is you want to find the mistakes right now, right in that point in time right now when that plane is in silver and easy to repair. Once it's painted with color and clear and trim, very, very difficult to go back and get those areas that aren't level. Needless to say, when all the floors are fixed in silver and you've put your paint, chosen your paint job, put on all the clear you want to put on, let it dry 6 to 8 weeks or longer, you'll be ready to go get some sandpaper, some Gorms, and begin buffing. Now, when you put an incredible amount of time and energy into a finish, detailing, inking, block sanding, sanding coats of clear, doing all the little detail work that makes for a front row plane, the last thing you want to do is have to go back and get one of the surfaces leveled. Keep that little note in your mind all through construction and all through finishing. Level. Level is a very, very important concept. The other thought is, if you have a plane that has either open bay wings, in this case, built up flaps, built up elevators, Any place that's an open bay of silk span, you're going to have to deal with that in a little bit different way. It's not practical to try to make those areas flat, but it is practical to make them as smoothly contoured and as definable as possible. When I say definable, I mean that each rib sticks up through the silk span and has a perfectly flat, straight edge. Now in this video, I'm basically going to try to cover what I think are the most practical ways, the practical shortcuts to buffing out SIG dope and acrylic lacquer. Those are the two primary finishes. Any finish, and this is John Brodak's personal plane, any finish that has a two-part top coat, Imron, Delphane, any of the two-part mixes, K&B epoxy, aren't really appropriate in this discussion. We're only going to deal with lacquer and dope. So without further ado, let's get down to the shop. Let's get some paint, some Gorms, some sandpaper, some steel wool. Let's get a plane to buff. Now, there's no reason you should ever be intimidated by buffing out a plane. And if you do the bottom first, and you make all your mistakes on the bottom, even the first one that you do, you should see some good results. The second one should be even better. And by the time you've done 4, 5, 6, some amount, you'll be teaching me what to do. Believe me, it's a learning curve, whether it's motorcycles or airplanes, but you have to start somewhere. Now I think it's a good place to start by describing some of the basics. If you were to look at a dope finish that was unbuffed, what you would find out is one of two things. This would be dope dries in little microscopic balloons. If you look under a high-powered microscope, you would see. And this is called orange peel. Now, for lack of a better word, orange peel describes these high spots. Usually they come between the ring and the tail, or any spot where the dope ricochets into one surface and bounces off. The second situation is when a surface has been sanded but scratches have been left in it. This usually occurs when somebody tries to hurry up the sanding process with using 400, 320, or in some cases steel wool. It leaves sanding scratches. These also tend to have a negative effect on the final finish. And the last situation is the one that we're trying for, we're striving for, and that is that the surface is perfectly flat. And that's a term you're going to hear me say over and over, because if the surface isn't flat, you're really never going to get the light to bounce off it the way it should. Flat is what I want to have. Now this was one of the first planes that I had ever finished. Harold Price had helped me. I didn't even have a driver's license yet. And he explained the basics, the absolute basics of doing a nice finish. And number one was that everything had to be flat. The wood had to be flat. The tissue had to be flat. The edges had to be smooth. Everything. Everything in the woodwork. And his woodwork was absolutely supreme. So from this, I went on to, I hope, each plane getting a little bit better and better. But I had so much practice with motorcycles. I wanted to make some basic difference in what I had learned, and it was real simple. It's something you can apply instantly. Flat, in terms of a model airplane, you want it also to be thin. This is a real important. Light. These are always considerations that you don't have in a motorcycle. When you go to do a motorcycle, paint can be thick. It's not unusual to put 30, 40 coats of lacquer on. The difference, and the reason I'm using model airplanes versus motorcycles as an analogy is, let's just pretend flat had two definitions. One was a paper-thin coat. The other one was flat. And yes, it was flat. They both reflected the light equally. But one was 10 times the amount of weight, heavy. And this is where it really gets to be a little bit complicated. Now, when I was younger, I always looked at cars and motorcycles and boats and guitars and whatever and said, gee, they're shiny, I want to make a plane that looks just like that. And the problem that I always had is I was able to achieve that kind of easily, but when I got to this was the killer. It was heavy. So what I'm going to try to emphasize in the next couple of minutes is this is the difficult part of doing a good finish. And in terms of buffing, the reason I'm saying this is almost anyone can lay on 20, 30 coats of clear dope, buff through without buffing through. To do it when it's very thin and light and not buff through, and get all the details and paint edges covered up but have it still be very thin and light is kind of difficult. This is kind of easy. This is kind of hard. So you want to be able to define, you're going to go buff that finish out. If you have a big, thick, heavy, tremendous amount of paint on there, well, it'll be real easy. You probably can use an automotive buffing wheel and it'll work, but it's still going to be thick, it's going to be heavy, it's going to be prone to cracking. What we're trying to achieve, and it's very difficult, and that's why I'm trying to put as many of these tips as I can on this tape, is that flat, very thin, very light finish that reflects light. Now, far later on in my career, with Harold Price's help, I was able to put the finish on the sweeper, and this was really the first one I had done totally on my own, and it was not a motorcycle paint job as such. It was a thin, very light, very attractive in terms of labor. Because it was an I-beam plane, it was very labor intensive. But when I had shown this in public for the first time, I realized I had just approached the point in my finishing career where this was starting to make sense, and I was starting to set up some basic do's and don'ts, some basic rules that applied to everyone I would do from that point on. Now, if you can picture the two choices, and again, this would be unbuffed and unsanded, the two choices, light is going to hit this surface. If the surface is perfectly flat, it's going to go straight off, reflect back to your eye. Think of a mirror. A mirror is a good example. If you're going to have a pile of things that has no reflection, like a piece of paper for instance, the light comes down and it kind of just either gets absorbed or it bounces off in all different little trajectories that don't appear to be attractive. This is what every person that does custom motorcycles, custom cars, model planes, whatever, and that's why I've taken so much time to emphasize the word flat. When it's flat, picture a mirror, perfectly flat, a piece of glass, flat. This is the whole thing, and again, I know this is boring and you're probably sitting here trying to fast forward through this, but before you go actually attack a plane, you want to get it flat. It's so important to have flat and not have to deal with orange peel. Now think of this scenario for 1 minute. Why do things shine? There's light coming either from sunlight, light bulbs, fluorescent lights, etc., etc. Why do they reflect differently? If you take an ordinary piece of paper, let's just take, for instance, the back of a photograph as a good example. There's no reflection at all. That has no reflection. Why does this side have reflection? This side reflects real nice. This side doesn't. One of the reasons is this side is a smoother surface One of the reasons is this is harder. If you were to take an instrument that could measure hardness, you would find out that this surface is relatively hard relative to this surface. So in talking about a lacquer surface, one of the things you always want to take into account, a diamond reflects real well, glass, lacquer, because they're all relatively hard. And that's a key thing to remember. The reason epoxies, two-part mixes, they have a different reflective quality, like monocoat. They always seem to look like plastic or like a photograph, because relative to lacquer, or relative to dope is a lacquer, they're soft. And if you have this concept in your mind, this is actually good information that you should have an understanding of. When a material is hard, a diamond, glass, you can buff that forever. But if it's soft, if a material is soft, like clay, or just to make a silly example of sheetrock, paper, things that are soft, you can't put a real shiny surface on. You need to apply a hard surface to the top of that to get that ability to reflect light. It's going to come from a hard material or a hard surface. And I know, believe me, I know, this part of it and this part of this video is probably relatively boring, but if you don't have these basics under control, you're not going to go on and you're going to make yourself 10 or 15 extra hours of work buffing out every airplane. These are the basics, whether it's motorcycles, whether it's guitars, whether it's boats, or whether it's model airplanes. You really should have a good understanding of hard and soft, flat, light reflection. And the combination of all those things is going to result in a beautifully buffed out paint job. The other part of this that you need to understand, and let's make a simple example of a dope finish, because time is going to be part of this. Time is always a factor when you're dealing with dope. Dope takes a relatively long time to dry out, gas off. If you put on your finish, starting with the lowest coat, and let that dry overnight, this coat, dry overnight, this coat, dry overnight, this coat, dry, no matter how you do this, and leave plenty of time in between for these coats for all the thinner to escape and evaporate, it's called outgassing. If you let each coat outgas, you will notice that as you sand, these coats get relatively hard. The reason they sand nicely is because they get hard. Remember, these are these basic concepts that if you don't understand them, boy, this can be frustrating. You can go and try to buff out a plane and it just won't buff out. And other times it'll just be so easy, it's unbelievable. Outgassing in the base coats. Now, outgassing also in the clear coats. No matter how many coats of filler, clear, lettering, whatever. If you give adequate time in between each one of these coats, you've stacked the deck, so to speak, in your favor. And now the final thing is when the last coat is on, when this absolute last coat is on, is to give this. The minimum would be 4 weeks. Even better, 6 or 8 weeks. Or in our case, the plane that we're going to physically buff right now, it's been sitting there maybe even a little longer. But the point is, the longer, the better. Now, I know that I've done many times is I've gone right out. Next day, plane is clear, start doing the wet sanding, and I'll start grinding down that coat. Whoa, boy, oh boy, get the buffing compound out. Yes, you can do that, but the work, it's so labor intensive. If you let time work for you, that dope has to get hard. And here we come back to that same old thing. If that last coat of dope gets really nice and hard, after 6 to 8 weeks, it gets very hard. Now the work that you have to do is going to be relatively easy. A good example of some of these models, Strega being one of them. is when I had finished the model, I was really running behind what I thought was my time window, time schedule, and I rushed right out, started sanding it and buffing, and I basically wanted to get the video part of it done so I could get into doing the detailing. And there's nothing wrong with that, but be sure that two things are going to happen. The first thing is going to happen is it's going to take a lot longer than it normally does. The second thing is later on you're going to go back and redo it. Because here's what's really going to happen, and if you understand this, then you'll be very prone to wait. When you paint this dope on, the first thing it's going to have this orange, even at a microscopic level. The surface, no matter how carefully it's applied, no matter how thin you put it, it's going to have a microscopic orange peel. Once that's sanded down and flat, it's going to reflect light real nice. You put some Gorms on it, yeah, that's going to be real nice. But what's going to happen, remember what happens on a rainy day, the door doesn't close, then on a hot day it does, a rainy day. This airplane is alive. It's expanded and contracting, and eventually this totally buffed out finish is going to start to look like this. Now this is why you'll see a plane that maybe is 6 months or a year old. You can almost see the grains starting to come through again, because that plane, it's like you've stretched the dope out, let it shrink down. Stretched it out, let it shrink down. It doesn't retain that real nice flat surfaces forever. It tends to keep a lot more of it if you wait the 6 to 8 weeks, but if you rush it, you wind up having to redo it. And that's the whole problem with rushing it, is you want to get to the point where it's hard enough that you minimize this. You'll never really eliminate it, but you want to minimize it. I want to mention some things about sandpaper, and I have tried over the years every possible way to take shortcuts. Sandpaper is one of those things where you'd be sanding away with 500, let's say, and say, oh, I'll just go to 400. That'll make it a lot quicker. You get to 400, oh boy, that cuts real quick. Oh, let's try 320. And what happens in this range here, it tends to leave scratches. These scratches typically look in the surface if you looked under a microscope, and you will see them in the final finish. If you're going to try to achieve perfection, the first thing you want to do in your hunt for Red October is make a commitment that you're not going to try to take the short way home. Put the 500 sandpaper, the 400, and the 320, and probably even rougher. Put that away. Get that out of your shop for now. 2000 sandpaper, I know several people have used. Ski Dombrowski, for one, uses newspaper. Newspaper is about the equivalent of 2000 sandpaper. Problem with this is you're just going to be there forever, and you're not going to really have a lot of fun if it takes you 4 or 5 days to buff out one flap. What I've found is over buffing hundreds and hundreds of motorcycles, and probably even more airplanes, it boils down to two choices. If I really want to do some cutting and chopping, I go to 600. But I really, when I'm trying to achieve perfection, the best finish you're ever going to get with dope is going to come from 1200, even 600 to some degree, may leave some scratches, you don't know. But I have found a system that I'm going to show in real time on a real plane of using 1200 sandpaper as my first choice. In fact, I'd even go so far as to put, 2 stars here. 1200 sandpaper is the material of choice. This is the way 1200 sandpaper is sold. It's sold in half sheets, normally half the size of other sandpapers. 1200 indicates that it's 1200 grit. That's the grit, the grittiness of the grit. Wet or dry means you could use this with soapy water, Windex, windshield washer fluid, any number of liquids that will carry away the residue. The reason for using it wet, it will prolong the life of the sandpaper. This is very smooth. You almost can't tell which side of the sandpaper you're using. You can see it'll sand skin even. 1200, and after, I don't even want to guess how many things I've done, how many motorcycles, guitars, boats, whatever. I always come back, when it's lacquer or dope, I always come back to my original system of 1200 and using it wet. Now just a few thoughts, because now that you have 1200 sandpaper, you'll notice there's a couple of choices. One is you can use the material dry, and it will cut. You can do a whole finish as long as you have a lot of sandpaper. What tends to happen, though, is it'll tend to clog up and put little scratches in your finish. It also will have relatively short life. So for that reason, and for that reason alone, we just tend to, at this point in time, give that the bad smiley face. That's really going to be disappointing if you try sanding dry with 1200. Now, to get the good smiley face, wet is the way to go. The choices that you have with wet are a whole lot better. And I know you're just dying to see some sandpaper touching paint, but let's finish up all these little technical terms. If you choose, and Harold Price was the one who, and actually on a motorcycle, it's not objectionable either. The reason is water and dish soap, which is a very inexpensive way to do it. The problem is if you get sloppy, water doesn't evaporate quickly and it'll tend to swell the wood, and then you're screwed. Then you basically have a big problem on your hands. If you choose another carrying agent, and there's other carrying agents beside M600, windshield washer fluid, several people, including Tom Dixon, have turned me on to that. That can work. But my first choice is Sikkens M600. Sikkens M600 is the equivalent of Prepsol, but with a little bit quicker evaporation rate. But both of these products will evaporate 10 times quicker than water. They'll evaporate so quick, if you fill a little dish up with them and go have lunch, when you come back, it won't be there. So for that reason, they work extremely efficiently. They cut quickly. They really make an unbelievably quick cut. They give a very smooth finish. The paper doesn't clog up, and you don't get those little rough spots where the paper had a little piece of what I call chewing gum, for lack of a better word. So what you can see here is, by a long process of elimination, we now have wound up with 1200 sandpaper and Sikkens M600. Normally you would buy Sikkens M600 where you buy body shop supplies, a body shop supply house. The product that you want is Sikkens M600. It's a degreaser. You want to use this with extremely good, and I say extremely good, ventilation. You don't want to lock yourself in a closet and start using this. You want to read all the cautions on the can. You don't want to get this on your hands any more than necessary. It will get on your hands. It's going to make your hands dry and kind of whitish. A little bit, I've never found to hurt. If you use this for 6-8 days in a row, your hands are really going to take a beating. Anyway, this is the item number. And again, it's available in body shop supply houses. You want to very, very carefully read all the cautions on the can and follow each one of them. It's a flammable material. It's poisonous, but it works extremely well. And at this point in time, if you're buffing out a plane, you want to start to learn how to handle hazardous chemicals. Paint is a hazardous chemical. Anything that's 2 parts is a hazardous chemical. You want to be always aware, reading the instructions, and taking all the precautions necessary. Also worth mentioning here, if you decide you want to try steel wool sometimes on a plane that has plenty of clear on it can be very effective. You only, at least I only want to try it. It'll be, you see where it gives you the, it'll say coarse. This one is extra coarse. Well, the one that you want is classified as 4.0. 4.0 steel wool. If you look at steel wool in the bag, this is really rough. This you'd use to take the roughest of rust off or finish. This is a little bit finer, but the product that you want to have, it's classified as 4-0 steel wool. And this is what it would look like. Now, the only problem I have with steel wool, I like to try it always, but I find that I'm a little heavy-handed, and I tend to go right through with steel wool. But again, you should try it, and you should try all the finishing products and supplies. You can try this wet, you can try this dry, both ways. But keep in mind, if you're heavy-handed, you want to go very gently with steel wool. Steel wool tends to cut a little bit quicker than sandpaper. Now, the actual compound that you're going to use to polish lacquer, buffing compound. They're known as buffing compounds. Anything with a grit is going to polish. At one end of the spectrum, the material is going to tend to be too rough. For our purposes, I find red auto compound way too rough. At the other end of the spectrum, if this was a scale of 1 to 10, probably newspaper would be a 10, red auto compound would be a 1. Actually, right in the middle, and this is where it gets to be a little bit of black magic. You can tend to take a lacquer finish, and this will happen, and the first time it happens to you, you'll be a little disenchanted. But right in the middle here, there's a material that's very, very difficult to beat. It's Gorm's silver polish. It comes in a pink tub. Depending on where you find it, typically in a grocery store, it's anywhere between $3.50 to $5.50 a tub. They don't make it anymore, as far as I know. It's not available even by us anymore. But if you happen to find some, this works the best. You can always call Steve DeJulia. He happens to have an unlimited supply of it. I think he built his whole house with it, in fact. But anyway, this material, for some reason, has exactly the right grit that pre-dried lacquer dope, or acrylic lacquer even, really responds to Gorm silver polish better than anything I've ever seen. Again, newspaper, it would probably take you a long time. It'll work. It works well. Toothpaste would get real expensive. You'd be going through 30, 40 tubes of toothpaste. I know it would work though. DuPont number 7 can tend to get a little gritty. That'll buff paint also. The liquid compounds, of which there are many on the market, they're expensive. I also have found, and this is a little bit of I guess a little trick. I got some compound that was in a little pink container one time, roughly the size of a Gorm's jar, but it was classified as extremely good car polish, and it was $30 for the same amount. I think what they did is put Gorm's and just put some oil or water or something in it. But anyway, this is a magic potion, and this is how we select the materials. If you don't do this process of elimination, you wind up trying to sand with 400, buff with newspaper, wait till it's not hard enough, it's too soft, I did this, I went left, I slammed my hand in a car door, a dinosaur bit my toe. I'm trying to eliminate all the possible ways, make this as easy as possible. And this buffing out a plane is difficult enough. You don't have to find ways of making it more difficult. And this is the material. It's Gorm silver polish. Don't be fooled by thinking you can buy the replacement liquid or you can buy some substitute. Always do a test. Some silver polishers will ruin paint. This won't. This is extremely nice material to work with. It's relatively inexpensive. You'll need roughly, at least I do, 2 to 3 jars to buff out a plane effectively, and then to rebuff and do your maintenance once a year. Again, this is the stuff that I have found works the best for me on hardened dope, not on soft dope, on hardened dope after it's been sanded with 1200 sandpaper. This is an old standby we used to use in the motorcycle days. We would buff out with red compound and then immediately go to DuPont number 7. This you can use with a buffing wheel. Now obviously I'm not going to be using a buffing wheel, a big automotive wheel on a plane, but this is one thing. Again, you could try, and this is good for maintenance, maybe once or twice a year. This will leave a coat of wax also, but it will clean. It'll take a nice little layer of paint off, oxidized paint. If you buy any of the big automotive brands, this just happens to be 3, and this is stuff we have in the shop. Keep in mind, fine cut. There's always rough cut. There's usually medium cut. And in terms of compound, there's always compound that's made specifically to be used with a buffing wheel, and there's always compound that's made to be used by hand. And it'll usually say on the material, if it's made to be used by hand, safely removes fine scratches, excellent for hand or machine use. Now, this is because this is geared toward the general public. When you go to a body shop, they'll have the same material in 2 different categories, one for machine cut and one for hand cut. This is important too. Contains no wax or silicone. The reason you wouldn't want to have this if you're buffing out a plane, if you go through and you want to touch it up, the last thing you want to do is have some silicone on there. Clear coat safe, that isn't really applicable to what we're doing. A couple of the other things you'd want to have on hand in terms of rags. You need some kind of a carrier for your compound. You can use roll after roll of Bounty paper towels. There's certainly no problem with that, and these are, as far as I can tell, the finest. Old white athletic socks. You can put one on each hand, and every time you touch or move the plane, you're going to be buffing some part of it. These are real handy to have. You want to have a selection with old towels cut into squares, maybe 6 inches by 6 inches. These are going to kind of get hard if you let them sit overnight. Cheesecloth is handy too if you just happen to have some pieces of cheesecloth laying around. Some of the mistakes you can make is to try to use up cotton or linen material. It tends to grind. It'll fold, make a hard edge, and grind. Actually, the best, if you don't mind just disposing of them constantly, is the Bounty, and I don't use anything but Bounty paper towels. Mike Rogers also has another brand that they don't sell in a store by me, and I don't even know the name, but it's basically like a Bounty that's a little bit cheaper and a little bit softer, and Mike's towels work well too. He brought a roll with him here, but again, I don't know the name. But if all else fails, get yourself a couple of rolls of Bounty towels. Now, some of the things you can expect that possibly you'll run into, I call them the frustrations of buffing. The first one is, and I don't even know how to identify it, but the paint won't come up. You're rubbing, and it never gets shiny. Paint might be too new. It might be too soft. It might be that the sandpaper you've used is too rough. It's left sanding scratches. Or that the compound you're using is unsuitable for that exact finish. So the first one, if you buff and you have a little bit of a feel, and that's paint, I call it coming up. If it doesn't come up, if after a real short amount of time it's not starting to look shiny, well, you know something's wrong. It's time to find out what's wrong. A second possibility for frustrations is that if your wood has got little high points in it, that as you buff through, these little high points are going to tend to come through. And it's going to be very sad. You're not going to be happy when you see in the middle of a blue or a red panel, the white or the silver comes up through. And that's almost always caused by not enough clear. If the clear is correct, that the wood underneath it is not really sanded flat, or some of the filler coats are not sanded flat. This will usually happen on edges, the edges of the ring, edges of the flaps, little pointy spots where you wear off the little point top. One of the things that allows me to do this kind of efficiently is I split up the work. And it's always a good idea. Just some of the things that are worth thinking about is to do the bottom first. And you're not going to reasonably do the whole plane in one sitting. So you could, in theory, pick some spots on the bottom. Bottom of the ring, bottom of the tail. get a feel for what's going to happen, how it's going to happen, how long it's going to take. I always resign myself to the fact of buffing out a plane. About a football game is about how long I like to buff, and then I take a break and do something else. Or just wait till the next day. But if you try to do it all in one day, you really are going to frustrate yourself. It takes too long. I like to start on the bottom. Now, another typical thing that can make you crazy is if you follow the procedure that I go over and over on every one of my videos on open bay wings, you'll know I have maybe 10 to 15 extra coats of clear, sprayed and brushed, on all of these edges, cap strips. But even that, if there's a high spot, you'll buff through. And you always want to be real careful on open bays. Open bays are a special consideration. You want to take a little more time. In fact, one of the plans you can make is to leave the open bays go for last. By then you'll have all of this area buffed out, all this area buffed out, all this area buffed out, and you should have your technique and your feel down to perfection. Especially if you do the bottom first. Save the open bays for the top and the top outboard wing for last. Now, having said that, we're getting down to the point where we have to buff some paint. But we always want to try to make it as easy as possible. I like to use this system. Removable flaps and rudders on most of my planes. Having a flap, a rudder, an elevator right in your hand, it allows you to buff it out a lot easier than if it's attached to the plane. The plane that we're going to buff right now doesn't have that option. We built it with the flaps all in one piece. Removable gear and wheel pans. Well, we do have removable gear and wheel pans. So this one we get a 1 thumbs up on. And extra clear on the edges, well, to tell you the truth, we got plenty of clear on the edges. And what that guarantees is that as soon as I start this actual buff through, I'll be going right through. And you can all sit around and have a good laugh. But anyway, I've tried to lay this out in a way that makes sense to me. I haven't taught school in a long time. Trying to lay this out in a systematic way because a lot of it is basic, simple, left, right, up, down kind of technology. It's not rocket science. It's basically a lot of labor and a couple of good pointers on how to do this, and you should be able to do this relatively easily. Now, as I've said many times before, in building and sanding and finishing and sanding silver, filler coat, whatever, including buffing, always start on the bottom first. Work your little techniques up on the bottom. And if you have a buff through a mistake, whatever, better on the bottom than on the top. Another thing worth mentioning on this video, the sun is your enemy. Anytime you think of ultraviolet light, it's one of the worst things you can do for an airplane is to leave it out in the sun unnecessarily. What Joe Adamusco and I have done with the Spitfires and Seafires is always try to keep them in the shade. We have a little what we call a hanger. What I used to do when I was flying this plane, Louisiana Lightning, is I'd have this white blanket and I'd just flip the blanket over it. Keep it out of the sun. The sun absolutely is the worst thing you can do for a plane is to leave it out in the sun unnecessarily. It's got to be out there for a certain amount of time, but it'll tend to pull fillets up. It'll tend to do all kind of nasty things to the white, turn it yellow, red, turn it orange. The blue will fade, but the worst thing it does, the absolute worst thing, it expands and shrinks the paint. And then you wind up, rather than that nice flat buffed out surface, you have to go right back and rebuff it over again. Something I'm sure you're not going to want to do. Now, I'm not so sure that this is exactly a thing that would apply directly to model aviation, but in real airplanes that race, the Reno Air Racers, I've heard, and specifically on Tsunami, they spent hundreds and hundreds of hours buffing the finish. The reason was there was roughly if I remember correctly, and I'll certainly stand corrected if it's 10%, but there is an aerodynamic gain in a buffed finish, and it's a significant gain. The gain comes from less drag. When you have less drag, it means ultimately you'll need a smaller diameter prop, less power, have to carry less fuel, less wear and tear on the motor, and that list can go on indefinitely. It's always an improvement to have a buffed finish. It also, in terms, the thing that makes me like it, it's cleaner. The plane, to handle it, is cleaner and neater. And obviously the last thing, the thing that means the most to most people, it meant the most to me almost all of my life. It just plain looks better. When you look at the finish on some of the Reno Air Racers specifically, some of the modern dragsters, hard not to like that buffed out, rubbed out, really shiny look. Now it's just hard for me to imagine anything that's nicer, more pleasant to look at than a totally buffed out plane at appearance judging, sitting there with as much wax as you can possibly get on it, and all the beautiful planes lined up next to it for the judges ready to do their appearance judging. It's one of the high points, one of the things I really enjoy about this hobby. It's been a long time since we were really active in painting motorcycles, but the things I learned have served me well, and I'm always glad to share them with you. And it makes it even more fun when you have a friend or friends that are basically doing the same thing and trying to outdo each other. That's part of the fun. As nice as all these rewards and awards and concourse awards and everything are, nothing seems to beat the enjoyment and the fun of just having a rack full of nicely buffed out planes. Now, a couple of real good tips I can give you. And believe me, this is the part of the job I love. Let's get dirty. Let's get down and buff some paint. Nothing quite as satisfying as actually seeing the paint right in front of your very eyes change from being rough and sandpapery to nice and smooth and shiny. Now you notice I have a bunch of old blankets. I like to take as many old blankets, an old bed pad, sheets, anything I can get my hands on, because at this point in time, the last thing in the world you want to have happen. These may seem like simple things. It may seem like things like, yeah, it's very simple stuff. How many people do you think I know that have been buffing out a plane and caught the end of the table, put a ding in it? Yeah. Including me, especially me. But the main thing is, there's a lot of basic, simple things to make it easier. This stuff is hard enough. Don't make it any harder. I have a little foam pad that cradles the plane while it's upside down. Again, you don't have to have exactly that. You can use pillows, paper towels. But the idea is to confine the plane and keep it that no matter where it hits, it's going to be nice and soft. Now, one of the little things that'll help in any sanding, buffing, this is just foam rubber. There's nothing special about this. Kenny has made these, Ken Thompson, other people have made similar things out of pieces of foam sponge. This used to hold a computer, I believe. Jeff Stiefel was the one that made this. I give him the full credit. Anyway, this is now my little confinement station for holding a plane in one place. Even if I was to bump it on a table, I have plenty of sheets. Now, we have built this plane in the last couple of months. This is the prototype for the Brodak Profile, Brodak Cardinal kit. And we basically put it aside to dry so that we could use this for our buffing demo. This is all SIG light coat. You can see it's relatively rough. I want to do a little walk around so you can see before we even start the job what the texture of the surface is, what some of the little high spots are. There's a little bit of dust, as always, in the paint. Little things that we want to work on getting out. It's the orange peel surface that we always come to expect with spraying on light coat. Now, a couple little tips. I have the Thickens M600 in a little spray bottle that I get from Consolidated. If you use a Windex bottle, you really can't put it in a dish. It evaporates too quickly. You need some kind of an atomizer if you want to use this. I have the fans going, so I have plenty of ventilation. You have a lot of choices here. You can spray the material right onto the surface. Again, you don't want to waste it. You don't want to use any more than you have to, but you want to get and keep the surface wet. Again, I always start on the bottom, give myself the benefit of a doubt. Always do a small spot at once. Don't try to do a whole wing panel. You know, you pick a small spot, maybe the size of a playing card, half the size of a playing card. Now you'll see it starts to ball up and dry up on you. Well, it's because you've lost the lubrication. You need to respray. Usually if it instantly becomes chewing gummy, you know one of the problems is you haven't waited long enough for the paint to harden up. Now I just want to do this little spot. Since it's all solid hardwood, relatively easy to do. This is not going to be a big problem. It shouldn't take a lot longer than this. That's the whole point. If it does, there's something wrong. See, now it's starting to dry up. You can see you get those little roly-polies on the sandpaper, which come right off. The purpose of the liquid, it's a carrying agent. It removes material, carries it away. So you constantly want to be flushing this material away. Anyway, we're closing, and this is probably enough on here right now. I want to get to this point. See, it used to be years ago, this was like a black art science, and you'd ask guys, hey, how do you buff that? Hey, how do you get that finish? And believe me, they'd laugh at you. It was difficult at best. Now you want to see if you have it flat. Remember that word we're looking for, flat? Before you go any further, if you can still see little spots of imperfection, sand it some more. But typically that would be all that you had to do. You really wouldn't have to do a whole lot more than that. Now, just so you don't think, see what I always suspect on these home shows that you watch is off camera they come in and sand it for 4 more hours. No, I'm never shutting the camera off here, because if you get an idea as to how much time is involved, you'll probably be real successful. Now you can go back and forth, I like to kind of combine motions, go back and forth, circle a circle. You start to feel a squeak, you know you've got it. It's the compound drying out. And this is the magic. When this starts to come through, and you can start to see this and feel it. I mean, I don't know if you can see that on a tape. I'll try to get it on a close-up. You can see up here where it isn't done, where it is done, and that is the magic of a buffed-out finish. Right there is what makes it all worthwhile. And if you use these simple rules and simple techniques, I don't think anybody would have trouble getting to this level. And this level will really get you in the front couple of rows at the nats every time. Couple of tips. You never really want to do this and sand an edge. You want to bring this edge down, this edge up here, but you really never want to go into an edge. You go into it, you're going to break that. That's going to be down to silver in 10 strokes of the paper. So always think of in terms of bringing it to an edge and then maybe just hitting that with your little extra material. Don't sand edges. Don't be too aggressive about edges. And again, you can see this is totally unbuffed. One of the things I like to do on an elevator or a surface this size is kind of divide it in half. I like to do half and half. If you try to do the whole thing at once, sometimes it just gets overwhelming. And I think you're always better off doing a lot of short pieces, even divide it in threes, than trying to do it all at once. Again, it's really not rocket science. It's a bunch of simple techniques. Another thing you want to be real careful of is when you're doing this kind of an area, you don't want to press down on it. You don't want to have this. I know people use finishing friends. I don't use one. I like the big soft pad as opposed to a finishing friend. And I'm not going to try to do this whole plane in one day because I'm working around rehabbing a house, doing some other work that requires that I break my sessions up into roughly 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours at night. So usually if I can get 2 hours in every night, 2 hours in the morning, I feel like then I'm making some progress. Now in this case, because I only have half of an elevator, I'll do all of the sanding. I'll get all the sanding done. Notice I'm not doing this. I'm working right up to the edge, but not sanding it. I'm staying a little bit away from the hinge line. Now, if I had removable surfaces on this would really make it easy, but in this case, we wanted to build a prototype plane very similar to the way most people that would be building this level of plane would be building it. Now, I've kind of got that flattened down. I can actually feel with my hand. So I can just work the material out into the other side. And after a while, you can pretty much figure out this is an angle, this is a corner, this is an open bay, this is this, and the rest of it is just repeating the same thing over and over and over and over. And if you do this X amount of hours, depending on how fast you are and how really nice you like it to be, you're ultimately going to wind up with it. But a lot of it starts in the preparation, getting the wood flat, using the right material. The right material is so important. I've heard of so many people that have tried using liquid silver polish, just ruined the paint job. Or if they're using steel wool and they're too aggressive, just going through at every cap strip before you're able to go back and back off a little bit. You want to really think about it. Now it does take a little longer. If we were using 600, we could be cutting this surface in about half the time. But we might have those sanding scratches that I was talking about. And because this material, another thing too, you don't want to have a bunch of this wrapping around and drying on the bottom. It just makes it look sloppy, and I don't think it does the paint any good either. Now I can usually tell by feel if I'm getting close. That's close enough, because I don't even use a different piece of paper towel to do the buffing. But I know I'm going to buff one side. I don't think there's many things that'll bring a smile to your face more than the first time. In fact, John Brodak was just down here a week or two ago. He buffed out one of the wingtips, and I could see a smile on his face. I could see. It's that feeling like it opens up a whole new door to the choices you have in modeling. Whether you're a scale modeler, RC modeler, sport flyer, it's nice to have the ability, the option to buff out the paint. Now you can see the stab isn't buffed, the elevator is, and I haven't turned the camera on and off, try to play some tricky kind of stuff. This will give you a real good idea just what this looks like. Nothing. And just so you can compare the orange peel surface. simple open bay. Just want to get one of these on. This is usually what you save for last. These you want to keep especially wet with whatever carrier agent you're going to use. You want to try not to go right up over the cap strips, go up to the edges. See, I'm going up to the edge of the open bay, but I'm not going out onto it. That's how you almost guarantee a buff through. Again, this is when you want to be a little delicate. You want to have the whole bottom done. You don't want to be fooling around and try to do this on your the first thing. Again, we're looking for that flat, the sanding to get it flattened out. Once it's flat, now you may be thinking, and rightfully so, because nobody experiments more than I do with different stuff, trying to save work, because I'm basically a lazy person. I'd like to get this done as quickly as possible so I could go up and have a pizza pie, but when I'm in this kind of a mode, it seems like an hour or two just goes flipping right by, because I get excited about seeing the end result. I really want to see the plane. I keep anticipating seeing it out in the bright sunlight where you can see all the little reflections off, especially on an open bay or on an I-beam or on the wheel pants or whatever it is. Now, one thing nice about this airplane in particular, the bays are relatively big. There's 3-inch rib spacing, so the bays are big. On a plane like an I-beamer, the bays tend to be small. The problem with that is your fingers, difficult unless you have little tiny fingers, and we're going to be doing our I-beam Spitfire, and I anticipate a lot of hours of buffing. A lot more, say, than an airplane like this. Again, you have to be realistic about it. Realistic. If there was a football game on today, I'd want to maybe dedicate top panels of the wing to a football game. Maybe the next day or the next session I had, same maybe 3 hours to the bottom and maybe 3 hours more for all the little peripheral surfaces. You're certainly not going to do it in a couple of hours. And I've made little gizmos up for buffing, and I've made little wheels, and yeah, and they all seem, a buffing wheel. I've known too many people that have taken a plane and broken it in half with an automotive buffing wheel. You can catch a flap, you can catch a lead-out wire. It's really dangerous. But nothing, if you have the patience and you have the little bit of information that either you get through this video or through asking any of the other people. This is certainly not, a Cold War secret how to do this, but it's one of the things that once you know how to do it, it opens up a lot of doors. You want to refinish furniture? No problem. You want to buff out some scratches on your car? No problem. Now let me just get a camera on this. See, the trick is I want it to actually show a panel being buffed so you can get an idea how long it takes to do that. How long? That's what a lot of people don't have just right now. You can see, here's the part that isn't buffed. Look at the difference in the shine. I mean, that in itself feels beautiful. Feels like a baby's behind. That is really nice. And now, obviously, it's a question of just repeating this over and over and over and over. And if you had an I-beamer, you're going to repeat it that amount of times, a Nobler that amount of times, a little Cardinal, a built-up Cardinal, a foam wing plane, we'd be done with one whole panel already. Anyway, that should give you a little idea of those little areas, just about how long should go into each little segmented area. Now, sometimes, of course it would be, if we were going to finish the whole plane in this session, I'd take the motor out, take the spinner off, just make it a little easier. But what I want to do, I just want to see that the paint on the whole airplane, I'm doing little test spots here and there, the paint on the whole airplane is hard enough. Because a lot of times up on the nose, I tend to put a lot more paint. It tends to be a lot thicker. So what will happen is up on the nose, it doesn't really dry as quickly. it'll still be a little soft. So this will be my final test, and this is all I'm really going to be able to do tonight. So I'll get as much of this done as I can, but if this paint up here, where it's absolutely the thickest, if this paint isn't any way too soft, then I know from this point on I can come back on the next session, the next couple of sessions, and just finish this, and there'll be no problem at all. I can take the wheel pants right off, these come right off. Again, on flat hardwood, it's kind of easy, it really goes quick. On open bays, you want to take a little more time. On little parts like the wheel pants, you want to take a little extra time. If you do decide you want to try using an automotive buffer, say for a foam wing, Glenn Metter was real successful. One of the ways you can do it is you really need to have somebody hold the aeroplane. I personally don't really like automotive. I have one, but I really don't like using it. And the reason is, again, it can hook a wheel pan, it can hook a flap, it can hook anything. And that plane will just self-destruct right in front of your eyes. But if you learn these little techniques and you're comfortable, now in my case, I sit here and I put on some old wings or something that kind of take my mind off the redundancy of doing this, and just resign myself to the fact it's not going to be done tonight. It's going to be a few days in the doing. But every time I do a little section, I just tend to stand back, look at it, let the light hit it. And I hope even this little work that we've done in this session has given you a little idea as to what actually you should be looking for when you're buffing. Now a small part, again, any part that's detachable, it's a no-brainer, take it off. In this case, these were the prototype wheel pants. We eventually hope to have a mold for fiberglass wheel pants, which will again cut down a lot on the labor. But the more little parts you can make detachable, of course reasonably, it means you can work in your lap or with a lot less distress than when you have a whole model sitting right in front of you. But I hope from this tape, from sitting through that whole boring dissertation in the beginning, I know that dissertation is boring. I know you want to just get on with it, and so do I, of course, but if you understand what these situations are. Now, if you were doing a little part like this, I always say you should have a couple little test parts, tip weight box, a flap, an elevator, so you can test the paint hardness. Remember that paint hardness is a significant thing. Dope is an extremely hard. When it's dried and cured, if you take dope that's a year old and go to buff it or go to repair it, it's like a diamond. It's super hard. And that's where dope gets its strength. A plane that's dope finished relative to a monocoat finish is no comparison. It's like butter and steel. The dope actually acts as a confinement, as a strengthening agent. The dope on a silk span wing with dope as opposed to monocoat is many times stronger. Again, having little parts in your hand like this just makes it so nice and easy. Now I remember just a funny story when I did the first sweeper, the blue one, the 1966 one. When I actually started buffing that plane out, I was over at Harold Price's house. And he did one panel for me, and he said, all right, try this, try that. This is a little too hard, a little too soft. And he says, you know what? Now you can imagine, I was a young kid, I didn't even have a driver's license, and I wanted to buff it. But the paint was only a week old. And he took me aside, gave me the best advice. It's paid off every day since. He said, you know what? Put the plane away. 6, 8 weeks, 2 months if you can stand the tension. That's why I always like to build models early in the year. This year is the exception, so that they sit here 2 or 3 months before you do the buffing. And then this goes as very, very quick and easy relative to trying to buff something out a week after, a couple of days after. I can just take all the fun out of it. Anyway, you get some idea what time is going into all these little parts. Now also another question that may be relative to this is how much clear do you put on a model? Well, on a nobler size model, a quarter clear light coat. A big plane, 2 quarts. You may think, well, wait a minute, the big plane isn't really twice as big. It's only 50% bigger, 500 inches to 750, but that's not true. Bigger wings carry more at an exponential rate. At a rate, for instance, a 747 carries more than a plane half its size smaller. And I know there's some scientific explanation that I don't know, but it's been explained to me, called Reynolds numbers. And we're not here to do Reynolds numbers, we're here to buff out paint. Anyway, that's pretty much ready to start the buffing operation. Again, just nothing quite, to me, as nice as having that finish buffed out. And when the parts are easy to put in your lap like these are, these little reel pants come right off. In a matter of 5-10 minutes, you have each one buffed. It's not a big deal at all. If they didn't come off, this would really be Mickey Mouse getting in there and trying to get all those little corners and angles. Anytime you doubt the value of these little parts that come off, hey, just leave one on the plane and buff one on the plane and one off. I'm sure you'll agree right away. It's worth it. And this is always a telling sign when I get one part done and touch one and touch the, oh God. Is this stuff worth it? So they really look and feel a lot better when they're buffed. Now, I always like to try as an experiment, just to satisfy my own little curiosity, and see if this material is going to be well suited to doing it with steel wool. And give yourself a little time. Always, of course, try on the bottom first, don't try on the top. Now I'm trying it dry first. You can see how it picks up the material. You just move it over a little bit to the next little spot. Again, steel wool tends to cut real quickly, so I really like to avoid going on the edges if possible. The saving is it'll go a lot quicker, well, a little bit quicker, but then you have to deal with the fact that you may or may not get some scratches. But if you try it on the bottom and it doesn't work out, you can always go back over and do with 1200. That'll pretty much take out the sanding scratches, and then you're back to where you really want to be. But always give it a try. Remember, it's always 4-0 steel wool, 4-0. The last test is get this wet, get it good and wet in fact, and try a couple of panels wet and see if it cuts any better. Again, you got to become a little bit of an experimenter somewhere along the road, one way or another. But you'll find a system that'll work real well for you. And it's the same with doing composite work, epoxy work. Big companies and people can only point you in the right direction. Once you come up with a system that you really like, is really working for you, you don't want to vary it too much. You don't want to go reinventing it. Now wet, it really cuts. It really chomps right down. You do a panel like this in about 2 minutes. But again, you have to evaluate it and decide. And in my case, I always seem to decide on the 1200 sandpaper as being the material of choice. And go back over the ones I did dry and just hit them wet again. And once you're armed with all that information and knowledge, the rest is kind of easy. The rest is just figuring out pretty much exactly what you want to do and how much time you're willing to spend. But I think once you see some of the surfaces all buffed up and polished, the decision will get real easy. I don't know if you can really see some of the scratches, but I don't really get the same results I do when I use the 1200, so I'm basically going to go back over it. You can hear the difference. I'm basically going to go back over this. But it's always worth it to try the steel wool. It's always worth it to give it a shot before you make that decision. Now just by going back over the steel wool areas with a little bit of 1200, I can get most of the scratches right out. And from this point on, I'm just going to work these panels till I run out of time, and I am running out of time here, but you can't really do this in one session. You really have to resign yourself to the fact it's going to take a couple of days. Maybe it'll take you a week. Joe Adamusco told me it took him 41 hours to buff out his plane, but his was immaculate, of course, flawless. But no matter what it takes, if you decide you want to do it, you decide you want to be up there in that front row, this is the ticket. So I blocked it down, took the scratches right out of it. Anyway, I don't think we're going to get much more done here tonight. It's always good to end a session on a positive note, and this was about as positive as you could get, getting a couple of the panels. At least knowing now that it's just a matter of time, piecing together the different segments, the flaps, the elevators, doing these little pieces and making sure that you don't get to the point where you're getting frustrated and tired. Good to always start on another day. Have a nice fresh day ahead of you. Now today, what I try to do, and this is good little tips that you can use, I guess, on any plane. I try not to get overwhelmed by this, because if you try to do it all, again, I've said that, in one shot, you're probably going to be disappointed, or you try to rush through. So what I'm trying to do, I try to split it up. Now tonight, after a day of work, I'm kind of tired, so I know I'm only going to have like an hour and a half to do on this. So I kind of maybe I'll concentrate on one wing panel tonight. I should be able to do a panel in an hour and a half. Basically lay out the leading edge in chunks like this. Each open bay as a separate area. This area separate. Maybe 3 areas here, 3 areas there. But what I like to do is try to make the work it's boring, redundant work when you're doing this, so make it as pleasant as possible. If you have a favorite TV show, or if you have some nice pleasant music in the background or something, it goes a long way toward if you're just sitting in a dark room doing this. I think there's a lot of things you can do to make the long job that normally would be boring a little more interesting. Well, you should take advantage of all that. Now what I'm trying to do here, leading edge is a nice easy area. I want to avoid doing this, rubbing the leading edge, because I know I'll break right through. I also know that on here I have a tape line where I've got tape. I've got an edge where the silk span ends. Now I want to go up to that edge, right up to that edge, but not touch it. Then I want to come this way on the open bay and just almost touch it, so that at no point in time am I rubbing right down on that razor edge, because it's only going to be a matter of 10-15 swipes and you'll be right through the paint. And I'm not going to try to, at least not on this tape, cover all the ways you could go about touching this up if you wanted to or had to. Rather than that, I'll try to put on this all the things that pertain to actually buffing it out, actually going right up to the edge and right up to it. It's so important not to, and never take open bays and go right over them this way, or you're going to go right through on every cap strip. But if you practice on a spot like the leading edge, turtle deck, nose, these are kind of easy areas. They usually buff up real quickly. You really should never have a problem. Probably good to practice on them too. And we've got some of the bottom buffed out, not all. I'm trying to work in random areas again, just to make it that it's not as boring as it has to be. Although there's no real way that I know of to speed this along. And every way that looks potentially like a way of really speeding it along can really otherwise be dangerous or be intimidating. You hold a buffing wheel on this. I've made up little buffing wheels to do open bays, and yeah, all of these things, they all seem like good ideas in the beginning, but if you practice the technique of hand buffing, somewhere down the road you'll be good enough and quick enough, you won't need any of these gizmos. And I think this can really work for you. Now, I've only worked on this a few minutes, and I'm trying to do, rather than doing a small area, I'm doing twice the size of an area, but I see I still need a little attention to it. But not getting right up on that edge is the whole key. If you work that edge where that silk span bay ends, you almost guarantee you're going to have a spot that you have to touch up there sooner or later. In case I can show what I'm, right now I can't feel, if I close my eye, I can't feel where that paint mark, where the line is, but I can feel now, as soon as I go out, this is still rough. So when I work this area, I'm not going to work up and over this, because now I'll be really getting that paint, the paint all along those edges I want to keep thicker than normal. And all during the preparation of the clear, if you've seen the videos that John Brodak sells on how to finish this, what you notice is all of these edges have double, triple, quadruple the amount of clear. But I still, even given that, I don't want to get into really hitting those edges. I don't want to hit those spots and make this any more dangerous or any more likely that I'll go through than I have to. Now, another thing, just thoughts. I'm trying to get all the random little tricks that I've learned that make this easy. A lot of times, here's what people try to do in an attempt at making the buffing go quicker. They scoop out a whole shovel full of Gorms, put it on an inch thick, and they got this big pasty globby thing on here, and oh, what a pain in the neck to do. It's not like that at all. You really need very little of this material. In fact, having a little bit less than you need is definitely better than having too much. And as an example, if you just take the gain is in having it right at this point where it dries out, and you'll feel as it dries out and the oil gets used up with the lubricant in it, you see what'll happen is it'll just get sticky where you just right at that point it's doing its best polishing. Right there is where you'd like to keep it. Putting more on right now won't make it any better, but the other trick is constantly moving the towel. Just unfold the towel just a little bit. Now, it was amazing. John Brodak was at the house the other day, just as an example of how quickly you can pick up on this. I bet it wasn't 5 minutes and he was buffing out little parts of the plane. That's how it should go. It should go relatively quickly. It shouldn't be an all-consuming thing. If all the preparation on this is done the way it should be relatively simple to get this to what I call buff up. Now see, you can see here's a spot we still haven't done yet. See how the light reflects? The light is bouncing all back and forth here all over. But right here it's a mirror right up. Just like in those little drawings that I was making that I know you really love sitting through in the beginning. Anyway, the little dull spot right there. Again, don't be tempted to put too much material on. You really don't need a lot. Constantly turn the towel. Constantly. A little is better than not enough. Pick a spot. Now, another couple of things. I've noticed some people, they do this, they go, and they're tired in 2 minutes. Do this as if it's a long race, a couple-hour race. Your arm is going to get tired if you don't. Just go at a pace that you're comfortable with. Just like doing some aerobic exercises. You don't have to make yourself crazy. You're not having a race to get done in 2 or 3 hours. No matter what you do, you're not going to be done in 2 hours. So if it's going to take a reasonable amount of time, set aside that amount of time. Now, I would count right now that the dope here is just the right hardness. We're using a pretty good selection of materials, and this is going as quickly as you can reasonably expect. I mean, within an hour, I should have this whole panel buffed out. And that's what I'm shooting for. If I try to do it in 15 minutes, it's not going to work out as well as it should. Now, right up here, you can see how dull and, well, orange, peely, lifeless here up by the Electrosets. Everything is lifeless, but boy, when it's buffed out. And again, my personal opinion is not many things look as nice as, or feel as nice. Even when you ripen a plain off, they have that nice feel. Just another thought, you ought to really be careful when you're spraying or doing an area like this or in the front of the wing. You want to constantly rub around, and don't let all the residue of the material float down to the bottom of the wing. Every once in a while, just give it a little wipe. If it does go down there, it tends to be a pain in the neck to clean up once it hardens and dries. So, again, I like to pick one little spot at a time. A lot of people are real comfortable using one motion or the other. I like to combine all motions. Circular, back and forth, front to back, whatever my poor hand happens to be in the mood for. In a fillet area, I want to use my bare hand. I just want to have the finger go right up in there. Usually that's the area where you have the most overspray at all, is right up in that fillet area. That's where you want to have either your pinky or, depending on the size of the fillet, just have the paper get right in there. Work that area. That's an area that should have a little bit extra clear on it anyway. Right up in that corner, and you can see. You'll wear out the sandpaper in an area and just move the sandpaper back. Move it back. So at the end, you can turn it around, get the other side. But a whole plane typically needs maybe 8-10 pieces of sandpaper total. You don't need sleeve after sleeve of paper to do this. One piece of sandpaper should last maybe 5 to 10 little sections of wing that you're working on. And what's really nice is at some point in time, maybe a third of the way through the job, you start to see enough results and enough shiny spots that you really get excited about. You say, gee, I wish I didn't have to go to sleep tonight. Wish I could finish this up. And then you get through a day of work and you want to come down and actually you just want to get going. You want to just get, that's how it was today. As I start to see results, I want to start seeing this guy come to life. I've kind of put all of the projects on the back burner because once I get in the mood to do this, you really have to be in the mood, and then you have to really just attack it. Now, you always hear people say, well, I just don't, that's too much work or too much energy, and if it doesn't suit your little personal satisfaction that you get from the hobby, then there really isn't much sense in doing this. But if you do enjoy seeing that really smooth, nice finish, and you know that there's going to be some kind of a price to pay, but at the end of it, you know you're going to have it. This is one of the areas I always notice judges at the mats. The first thing they do is rub their hand down the fillet. And if they feel a really nice fillet, you're probably going to be one row further up than you would be if you didn't have the fillets really detailed out. So I tend to spend a little more time than normal. Fillets, I know the question everybody wants to ask, how do you make fillets that don't bubble? Don't ask me. They bubble. Put them out in the sun. Some are better than others, but almost all at some point in time get to be a problem. Be a little bit of a nuisance. So anyway, it really is nice. When that little area, that's one of the focal areas, when that starts to take shape and you start to really see your reflection down there, can see the fillet area is buffed right on there. Now we're going to work our way out onto the wing. Now this is always one of the areas that's kind of a pain in the neck, is what happens because you have a lot of orange peel here. The dope is falling into here and making a very rough area. But I want to do, first off, I always like to do the fillet. But now I have a spot where the shine or the softness of the fillet ends, and I want to blend that right in. Well, there's a lot of different ways of doing that, but I don't want to go back into the fillet any further than I have to. A good way to do that is try to use one way to use a circular motion. Try to clean up as much of it. Use a random motion. Because what will happen, again, you're trying to avoid going on those cap strips edges. If you start buffing one little area, especially this guy's kind of pointy, one little edge, you're almost guaranteed going to go through real soon. Also, it's a good idea maybe every 2 or 3 or 5, I don't know, depending on how much you use, little areas that you're doing, and again, I like to divide it up, is just go and replace the paper towel. Don't try to use one paper towel to do the whole job. Get a little look at how this is coming out now. It's very rewarding. It's very rewarding to me because I appreciate the quality of a hand-rubbed, hand-buffed lacquer dope finish. Now you can see we've got this part buffed out. We haven't started the bays yet, and we haven't gone out onto the trailing edge. But by doing one little spot at a time, I haven't bitten off more than I can chew. It doesn't get boring. If in doubt, do a playing card size piece and move to the next piece. I think most of the people that get bored and disgusted, they get bored and disgusted because they're trying to do a whole panel at once. And again, I've said it 100 times, never try to go over cap strips like this. You need to do one bay at a time. On an I-beam plane, like an Aries say, you need to do that one little section. And at all costs, avoid the ribs and cap strips. They'll get taken care of automatically. Even if you don't buff them, as you wipe the plane off in time, you'll hit those areas. So for this point in time, just try to do the flats, all the flats, the fillet areas. It's really slow. Now, relative, you can hear it. It's a totally different sound. Really feels nice. Again, this is my personal enjoyment that I get out of the hobby, is doing this part of it as well as I can. Now, another little thing, when you're going over letrosets, you know, inevitably there's going to be, I have a lot more clear on the letrosets than on the areas next to them, but I really still want to be kind of cautious and be aware that as soon as I see I'm going through either an ink line, a paint edge, a letroset, or a flap edge, as soon as I see I'm going through, there's no point continuing the sanding. That's going to have to be a touched up area. So just kind of deal with that right at that point in time. Now if I go through any areas, while I'm doing the other wing, I can put a little touch up on this wing. And you hope that in time you get to the point doing this, or you get the feel, the technique, or whatever it is that you ultimately wind up with, the skill level, hand-eye coordination, that you're never going to go through. Now I always look at the sandpaper. It's not blowing up on me any worse than it should. It's probably time for a new little chunk of sandpaper. It doesn't hurt. Maybe 3, 4. Again, this is a personal thing. If money is no object in your finishing program, change your sandpaper every time you do a bay. But I try to get some kind of value out of it. No real reason to. I guess I just was brought up in a household where nobody ever wasted anything. Again, it's personal. You got to tailor a little program right to your personal little needs. Again, I'll take a new spot on a towel. I know a lot of this gets redundant, but what happens is if you're missing one step of it, the whole thing can get more difficult than it needs to be, more time consuming. And I guess that's what a lot of people that want to pick up this skill, what they're really asking is not how do you do it, but how do you do it without having it take forever. I know people who have buffed out a plane, they've taken a month. It really doesn't take that long if you're kind of resigned to not inventing anything, using all the techniques that have worked for even before I was in the hobby. I'm sure these techniques are not new. They're shared by people in the automotive industry, the motorcycle industry, the custom musical instrument industry. They all basically are using the same techniques. They're well publicized, and these are the ones that I've tried to fine-tune for our event. And boy, when that's done, you compare that to a flap, or even just the feel. I know I say that over and over again, but I really do enjoy that. I got pass on a funny story. This is absolutely true. One day I was showing somebody who will go unnamed, because we don't want to embarrass him, of course. Giving him a little sharing techniques that I used to buff and they used to buff. And the gentleman in question insisted that there was no need to take his jewelry off. He had a nice big ring with a big stone in it and everything. And I remember thinking, oh man, that's gonna be a problem. And about halfway through the buffing, I remember hearing something that we can't repeat on video, and that ring had left a big gouge in. Now, one of the things for sure you want to have on is no jewelry, no rings, maybe not even a watch. I'm kind of careful. And nice short fingernails. If you're one of these people that works in an office or works at a job where you don't use your hands and your fingernails are sticking out like Dracula, you really want to clip them down the week you do this, because it's so easy. And the reason I'm thinking about it, I just almost hooked my fingernail on the edge of a flap. You really want to make this, again, the whole thing to remember about this, it's hard enough to begin with. It's labor intensive enough when you don't have to go back and patch and fix and do things over. It's just nice if you can get as many of these things out of the way early on in your buffing career and not have to go back. I remember Mike Dietrich, and true story, Mike Dietrich called me one day, and he's the king, one of the kings of I-beam wings. And we were talking and chit-chatting, and he says, I just accomplished something amazing. I finished buffing out his first I-beam plane that he had ever done without putting a hole in it. And I said, well, Mike, you're better than me. I've never done that. Every I-beam plane I ever made, I always wound up putting a belt buckle, a fingernail, or a pencil or something through it. So there are little rewards. Now I get to the point where I only do it on every other plane, but still, you want to be aware of. Don't make it any harder. Don't find ways of making this harder than it has to be. Getting the plane to go from rough over orange peel over spray to nice shiny paint is really difficult enough. You really don't have to try to make it any more difficult. And I'm about ready to do the bays. Now, one of the things I like to do is I like to pace myself. I don't like to try to do more than I have to, or less than I have. I don't want to do this when I'm real tired, because then I start getting lethargic and I'm not paying attention. But if you break it up, again, break it up into whatever amount of time you feel you can. You'd hate to get up Saturday morning early and try to do a whole plane in one day in 12 hours. But if you took 6 sessions of 2 hours each, you'd get a heck of a lot more done. Probably even, not that you would enjoy it, but it would be bearable. It would be remotely bearable anyway. I just think it's better to have a lot of small sessions. And I think what I'm going to do is set my goal here tonight is to just finish this wing. I'm not going to try to go any further. Now, one of the things in my family, it's real easy to make these decisions, because we have a little system in this house. Karen knocks on the door 3 times, and I know that tells me I have 10 minutes till supper. So that usually means I can get 1 or 2 more bays done, and that's about it. But seriously, and I try to make it enjoyable to watch the tape, of course, not too boring, except for that beginning where you have to lay that out. But there has to be a time when you're realistic about it. You don't want to do this for 6 or 7 hours if you don't have strong upper body strength, and the next day be a cripple. You don't want to do that either. You got to be realistic about it. And probably after doing 1 or 2 planes, you'll know your limit. You'll know you can do an hour or 2 a night, 2 hours a night, whatever. And you'll be very realistic about it. Now, what I've gotten to the point with this wing where I've got the leading and trailing edge done, but not the bays. and you can see the whole perimeter of the ring. I have like a shadow box around the bays. And the next thing I'll do, well, I can do the flap too. The flap is same as doing the elevator, but I'll do one bay at a time now. Doesn't really matter where you start, but one bay at a time is usually a real good program for doing this. A couple little tips, again, open bays, top open bays. You'd like this upper surface of the wing to be as perfect as possible. This is not a good place to skimp on sandpaper. So I will take a new piece. I don't want to make the sandpaper any bigger than it has to be, because I want to be looking and constantly, again, avoiding those edges. If there's only one thing you get out of the video, avoid the edges. Keep the area flooded with material. That's what makes the sanding go quickly. Now this airplane is not an exceptional airplane in terms of finish, one like the Spitfire or the Seaflyer where there was tremendous amount of detailing on it. You had to really be a lot more careful, because I really was kind of afraid of going through my rivet lines and ink lines and hatches and guns and cannons and steerable tail wheels and things, but this one certainly, nice big smooth surfaces. The open bays are 3 inches wide, so it makes them very easy to buff out. If this is the first time you're ever going to buff out a plane, doing one of these is very easy relative to an I-beam. A foam wing, of course, even easier. Again, maybe if it's the first time you're ever buffing anything out, you want to leave the bays till last, or you want to do a foam wing first. Or a lot of times it's a good idea, because dope tends to harden with age. Best thing to really try to do is go find an old plane that's a year or two old, flip it over and try to buff out the bottom, assuming it has some clear on it, and do some practice on an old plane before you go attack a new plane. Another good idea. See, most of this, I don't say most of it, almost all of it is just common sense. The rules apply, and an old thing that I always remember is the rule of gravity always applies. It doesn't matter if you're a machinist or a brain surgeon. Gravity is still gravity. Good is still good. Smart is still smart. The rules don't change. Buffing, whether you're polishing a stone, a rock, a geode. I know George is a geologist. A friend of mine, George Ventrini, is a geologist, and he polishes geodes. He does beautiful work with stones, polishing stones. But the rules are exactly the same. The rules don't really change. You find a system that works for you. Try all the systems that are available. Now, for instance, just as an example, if you've read in the magazine that such and such a person found a better way or a different way or another way of doing this, well, I would encourage you to try it immediately. Run right out and try it. Try their way, your way, my way, John Brodak's way. Try all the ways and see which suits you the best. Don't be convinced that there's only one way to do anything. There's a lot of ways. And that part of this event that seems very special to all of us, to me anyway, is that we're able and willing to share the information so that virtually anybody that's willing to put in the work can have a plane similar to this, the same as this. There's no drag racing secrets. There's no real incredible, difficult things to do that you might have to risk your life to do. This is just labor. Let's get a little look at this guy here. Well, it doesn't take long and it comes right to life. If you can appreciate, and I don't know if you can, the change, how a whole plane changes from being just a thing of beauty, from something that's kind of rough to handle and a little gritty, and the buffing is just such a giant part of that. Well, we're at the end of this session. This is the second session. I really feel like we're making some progress here. The open bays, of course, they facet light beautifully like a diamond ring does. And I always look around at the end of a time like this, and I try to see, make a little progress, give me something to dream about. And now, of course, the one thing, you go over here, notice the color change. the color actually changes from whatever you would call unbuffed paint to buffed paint. Well, it's a whole different ball game. The colors, to me, they get a lot deeper and a lot more beautiful. No matter what color it is, it really, when it's buffed out, I mean, it's just hard to describe how nice that looks, how nice it feels. Anyway, we'll be getting on to the next wing tomorrow, but it's good to know that one of them is in the bank already. Today I just wanted to show a couple of the other little tricks or techniques that you can blend into your program to make the job of buffing paint as easy as possible. One of them is the sock. The sock, you can put one on each hand. Now the advantage of, these are old athletic socks turned inside out, so they have the terry cloth piece facing in. Needless to say, wash them so there's no dirt or grit in them. Take the Gorms, put it on both sides of the sock. Now the advantage of doing this is you're actually buffing both sides of the plane at the same time, or wherever you're holding the plane, you in effect are buffing it also. Of course you have to sand it with the 1200 first, but the socks become just another tool in your arsenal. Now I'm going to, before this tape ends, I'm going to try to hit on just some of the other little techniques and things that you can use from place to place on a plane. And hopefully by combining all of them and combining other people's ideas along with mine, you'll come up with a system that will allow you to have the best of all possible worlds and the most enjoyment possible from the hobby. Again, I want to emphasize over and over again, because it really is a pitfall to think that there's only one way to do anything, any part of this hobby. Any type of painting, any type of buffing, any motor, any prop, any control system. There's always a lot of alternative ways, and you want to try to pick the way that'll make the hobby the most enjoyable for you, the most rewarding. Sometimes that's difficult and confusing, but I think ultimately most people do figure it out, and in doing so get the most enjoyment they can out of the hobby. Now as soon as you get done with that, of course, that's one of the things you can always use in certain areas. Typically on flat pieces where you can get your hand underneath and on top, you're actually buffing both surfaces at the same time. One good technique you can try. Now another little trick I like to use is, I find it more comfortable to always work in a horizontal position, not in a vertical. So when I want to do, say, this area, or a flat area like the side of the fuselage or the rudder, what I have is a chair, a little stool with a notch cut out of it, and of course some kind of padding. I just wedge the plane in. The table is all padded and that, and it acts the same way a finishing friend would. A finishing friend is another way, the thing that hooks on the motor mounts. I just feel this gives me better support, gives me more maneuverability for working around. Now for me, this is the most comfortable way to work. But again, I can't emphasize this over and over again, there's many good videos out on the market. Bill Harding, Bob Hunt's, my own, and you should try many other I'm sure I'm not familiar with. Sam Shirota's made a couple. But you should watch them all. If you're really intense and you really want to learn all you can, learn from everybody. Never try to just assume that there's one way to do things. That's the golden rule is learn from everybody. And then pick the way that suits you the best. Now I've found this, for instance, is one nice little way. I was not a big fan of finishing friends. I just felt from my the way I worked and in my shop conditions, it always seemed like if something was in the way. But this way, and a side benefit of this way, is it's real inexpensive. Now we're almost at the end of the tape. We're coming up on it. I want to show just some of the other things that may or may not be of value to you. We'll obviously finish a couple of parts that are left to buff on this plane in the next day or two. But there's still some extra little thoughts that I'd like to include on this video, and encourage you to watch all the videos from everybody that makes videos. Get information from any source you can, anybody that's willing to share it with you, and then homogenize it down into a system that works well for you. There's a couple of people I really have to thank, especially Harold Price, for all the information and inspiration he's been over the years, the late Harold Price. And a special thanks to John Brodak. I hope that soon we're going to be able to see these exact videos available in hobby shops as rentals as well as purchases. I think that'll do a lot to promote the hobby. I hope we see all the videos available to make you enjoy, allow you to enjoy the hobby to the max, and share that information always. Now just a few brief closing thoughts. If you're not a member of Pampa, or if you've never seen Stunt News, please check it out. It is really a worthwhile publication. Here's the address if you decide to subscribe. It's an excellent value. It's probably the best value in the world of model aviation. Some of the stories, the pictures, if nothing else, excellent. Many, many excellent finishing, sources of information, building, contest results, excellent things, and excellent value. If your local hobby shop doesn't stock these videos, call them and tell them to contact John Brodak and get them in stock. There's other very interesting videos, specifically the Nobler construction videos, a lot of the videos that are been done over the years of the Nationals and team trials, videos of how to lay out a new paint job so you'll have an original paint job. The list just goes on and on. Be sure to have the latest John Brodak catalog and the latest Windy catalog. In fact, a good idea, get all the subscribers in Pampa, all the people that advertise, and get all their catalogs. There's even a whole series of videos on the building of the actual plane, the prototype Brodak Cardinal that we're working on and buffing out right now. And this, of course, will be added to this list as one of the videos that are available. Excellent information. I think all the videos that are out, and I emphasize that, they're all excellent. They all contribute one brick into the wall that we all can get our information from, and we should try all of them and find out what suits you the best. Now, another side thought you want to think about is whenever you do buffing, you really like to be under fluorescent lights. Get rid of all the incandescent bulbs in a room. They tend to mask over little errors and flaws. And when you get to this point, you'd like to be able to pick up all the flaws you possibly can in your work. And fluorescent lights allow you to do that the best. I can candle along the side of the body, the side of the rudder, and I can pick up little flaws that I may want to work on. Now in my shop, all the lights are fluorescent. There's absolutely no incandescent lights, and that allows me to pick up all the flaws I can. Then when I take these airplanes out into the sunlight, of course you don't see the flaws anywhere near as much, and they always look better, but it's a big advantage to have fluorescent lights. by now you should have a nice dirty table and plenty of used sandpaper, a couple of old socks, and you should really have something that you're proud of. When you finish up a plane like this, you really do have, I guess, some pride in workmanship, pride in what you've just accomplished, and always share what you learn with other people. It's possibly the most rewarding part of the whole hobby. One of the most rewarding things, helping other people. Now, just some of the other planes that I've worked on. I have a minute or two left on this tape. For anybody that hasn't seen these airplanes, we have videotapes of buffing, building, finishing, flying, of all of these tapes. And we're going to be adding to this list of videos in the future, the near future, the faraway future. There's a lot of good technical information. A lot of good information. It's just fun to have, fun to know, fun to share with your friends. And there's nothing quite as nice to me, and I'm sure Harold Price, if he were alive today, he would agree. Nothing quite as nice as when you just take your hand, just touch that rubbed out finish. Oh, gee. That's one of the things that's always attracted me to this event, this hobby. And it keeps you, I guess, engrossed for a lifetime. And now it's time to just look back. We've added one more to our little Air Force, to our little entourage. Again, I hope you've gotten some really good information off of this tape. Please share it with all your friends. Share all the information. Thanks for joining us. It really was a long journey from way back in the time of Harold to now, but it's been a long ride. It's been a lot of fun. All the hard work is over, and once you take this out in the sun, all that labor seems well worthwhile. It's a labor of love. It's a trip, and I hope you'll enjoy it.